Inaction in the face of injustice makes an individual morally culpable. I affirm this resolution on the grounds that we have an obligation to prevent injustice, and my value is societal welfare. Inaction is lack of activity or action. Injustice is absence of justice, violation of rights or rights of another, or unfairness. Moral is of or relating to principles of right and wrong in behavior, or ethical. Culpable means guilty. Where would we be in this world if someone didn't stand up for what they believed in, or what they thought was right because they thought they weren't affected? Would we be here? Would the Pilgrims have come when under such oppressive rule? Would the Nazi regime still control Europe today? Would segregation of races still exist in this world? Would we know the likes of George Washington, Winston Churchill, Rosa Parks, or Martin Luther King Jr.? These people knew that simply standing on the sidelines in a game that looked to be over could do no good. I want you to think about the argument my opponent is going to try to make. Think about how she will talk about the good of the individual and the importance of placing yourself above all else. Does individualism begin to walk a fine line with selfishness? Can we afford to think in such a manner when the problems at hand seem to be growing exponentially? Think about the resolution and gather your thoughts about what you believe personally. Now, understand that when you are no longer guilty for doing nothing, you cannot contribute to the common good. Confucius stated, "Faced with what is right, to leave it undone shows a lack of courage." This is what you are guilty of. You are guilty of showing a lack of courage. A bystander is one present but not taking part in a situation or event. A bystander affect is a social psychological description of failure to help or intervene by a crowd or in a group in an emergency situation. I want to tell you a story of a terrible case of the bystander effect, one of these failures. It was a crime shocking not only in its brutality, but in its callousness. Richmond police say, a 15-year-old girl leaving early from the homecoming dance at Richmond High School was enticed into a darkened alley just off campus to hang out with as many as a dozen young men who were drinking. When the girl joined in and became drunk herself, police say, the men attacked her. One after another, as many as 6 men raped the girl. Police said Monday. Others watched. For more than 2 hours, no one tried to stop the attacks, and no one called the police. What's shocking about it is that there were so many people willing to involve themselves in such a serious crime. Police Lieutenant Mark Gagan said, equally shocking, he said, was the number of people who witnessed it and who were in the area of it occurring, who did not take the steps to stop it, report it, or help our victim. The attack happened Saturday at about 9:30, shortly after the girl left Richmond High Gym where the homecoming dance was still going on. Police believe she was waiting for her father to pick her up outside the school. Could this crime have been stopped if the bystanders believed that they owed some duty to the girl, some social or moral obligation? Their inaction makes me sick to my stomach. Their inability to act makes me wonder if they felt guilty. A refutation to the story makes me wonder what values my opponent holds in her argument, and if these values are found throughout the world. That thought that others might believe they should not feel the need to act or stop the attack or even call the police makes me sick to my stomach as well. Martin Luther King Jr. said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all directly. Affects all indirectly. Excuse me. This tenet has defined institutions since its inscription, and those that believe in such a tenet flock to these institutions. If you truly value individualism above all else, natural selection should have taken care of you already. But if it hasn't, know that society has made you who you are, and that societal welfare helps the individual so that the individual may help themselves. Collectivism gives birth to individualism. Therefore, we must place the good of society before ourselves in hopes that others may do the same. So listen to my opponent's argument and understand that it is necessary only for the good man to do nothing, for evil to triumph.
Can we clap? Not generally.
We want to clap.
It's awkward, isn't it?
It is
Normally,
really
normally
awkward.
this is how cross-examination
Reset
happens.
it.
Both buttons at once.
Yeah, hit the minute
top
and
and
the
bottom.
second button at the same time.
Thank you.
Okay, I have a few questions for you based on the arguments that you made. You brought up the example of what the world would be like if people hadn't intervened in horrible situations in the past. And some of the examples you gave were Rosa Parks. One question about Rosa Parks. When she intervened, was she being directly impacted herself by the situation, or was she standing up for a group of people that she had no relation to?
I would say getting up and moving to the back of the bus is being affected directly by the situation.
Okay, so she intervened in a situation that directly affected her. What about George Washington, who is another example that you gave?
I too would say that he was directly affected.
Do you have any examples of people who stood up for individuals who they had no connection to or were not at all impacted by the situation?
I would say that when Gandhi helped Martin Luther King Jr.
Okay. You also quoted from Confucius and said that not acting shows a lack of courage. Is that the same thing, though, as having a moral obligation or being culpable?
I would say it does.
Okay, so if you being not courageous is the same thing as being morally responsible.
I would say that there's some connectedness there.
Okay. And I think that's all the questions that I have.
Okay.
That was awesome. I loved that part. Did you take any questions?
No.
So if you think of it, MJ, give her 6 minutes.
7 minutes for the speech.
Sorry, 6 after a minute has passed.
Yeah, okay. Like, I don't know if I'm gonna be able to do that.
Do that speed reading we watched on that video.
I have to go get my inhaler. Okay. No obligation to the impossible is binding. So said the great Roman philosopher and statesman Cicero. My agreement with this principle is why I stand in negation of the resolution resolved. Inaction in the face of injustice makes an individual morally culpable. Before presenting my arguments, I would like to provide a definition of culpability from the Oxford English Dictionary, which equates this term with being guilty, criminal, and deserving of punishment or condemnation, and my opponent agrees with this definition. Therefore, the resolution today is asking us to consider whether inaction in the face of injustice makes an individual guilty of that injustice. It implies beneficence as an obligation rather than an ideal. I would also like to note that the resolution is stated in absolute terms. The resolution does not state that individuals are occasionally or in some scenarios culpable of inaction. So we must interpret the resolution to mean that in all instances when an individual perceives an injustice, they are obligated to act or are themselves guilty of the injustice. With these observations in mind, I have chosen the value of justice. In its article on justice as a value, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy notes that what individual justice most naturally refers to are moral issues having to do with goods and property. I believe the criterion that best upholds this value of justice is the social contract. This idea was popularized by French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau and said that individuals' obligations are based on tacit and implicit agreements between members of a society to cooperate for social benefits, usually by sacrificing some individual freedom in return for state protection. By this standard, individuals can be considered just if they uphold these limited obligations. For a better understanding of these ideas, I present the following 3 contentions. Contention 1. Individuals' obligations are limited and role-specific. Subpoint A. Societies are created to support individuals. Social contract theorist John Locke stated that the great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. When we understand that the purpose or motive of creating communities is to promote the individual, we see that any obligations that undermine the individual and their property run contrary to the value of justice. Subpoint B. Obligations are limited to the sphere of the social contract. What I mean by this statement is that there are instances when individuals are obligated to put the common good above their own self-interest, but only in cases when there is a clear social contract. This would mean, for example, that individuals should be willing to submit to reasonable taxation by the government of a society in which they are a citizen. It is not reasonable or just, however, to oblige a citizen of the United States to pay income tax to Afghanistan or Rwanda just because those countries may have greater need of that money. In the same way, a parent is obligated to make sure that their child is fed, clothed, and educated, but they do not hold the same level of responsibility for someone else's child. I should have brought water up. Contention 2. Beneficence is an ideal, not an obligation. Any sacrifice of one's wealth or time beyond that which is required in the social contract is a personal choice, but it is not a moral obligation. American moral philosopher Bernard Goethe believed that individuals have no universal obligation to beneficence or directly doing good. His theory, which does allow for role-specific responsibilities such as a social contract, emphasizes instead only the obligation to not directly cause harm yourself. But it says that any positive action of beneficence are ideals rather than obligations. Which brings me to my final contention. Holding individuals accountable for impossible ideals is in itself unjust. If we were to uphold the resolution, individuals would be required to sacrifice in the face of injustice anything that would not cause an equivalent moral bad for them. For example, if you are aware of a person who is starving, you are obligated to feed that person to the extent that it does not require starving yourself. Even further, it would mean that if you chose to spend that money on, say, an iPhone, or a new pair of shoes, or even something as important as an education, you would be morally culpable, guilty of that person's death from starvation. While it might be ideal for individuals to be charitable, expecting humans to give up everything but the most essential of needs for the benefit of strangers goes well beyond the realm of the obligatory. Given the world we live in, it would have no end. Few, if any, humans have ever achieved such a lifestyle, and one of them, Mahatma Gandhi, once noted that an unjust law is itself a species of violence. I'm now going to turn to my opponent's case. His value is societal welfare, and I believe that justice is a necessary value in order to have societal welfare. So I think in this debate we have to consider justice the preeminent value. A society without justice, as even Gandhi says, is a society not worth living in. His first argument is that the world would be terrible if people didn't live up to the expectations of the resolution. But all of the examples he gave are people who acted in role-specific ways. Rosa Parks was part of a community that was being discriminated against, and she, like Martin Luther King, chose to stand up for that community. It was part of their social contract. The same is true for George Washington, who felt a great injustice being done to his community, the colonists of North America, and stood up to the evils of King George III and the unfair restrictions that had been put on his community. Even in the case of the Holocaust, those who eventually fought against Hitler were either people who were part of the German society and opposed his views, or people who were directly impacted by his expansion and conquering of territory. Very few, if any, of the people who stood up had no personal interest or no social contract associated with their actions. There were not, for example, people from the Sudan who decided, I've heard of this injustice and I'm going to go take care of it, although it does not impact me in any way. So I think that in many of his examples, there were actually social contracts that were being upheld, not some sort of random beneficence in which the person was not an interested party. I also want to address the issue of the attack in Richmond that he mentioned. This is another case where it involved a person's direct community, and it was a role-specific observation. If you are a bystander, if it is someone who is part of your community who is undergoing an injustice, then you would act. But, for example, this morning I read an article about women being harassed in Egypt frequently during the protests against their current leadership. I did not take an action against that, and I don't think I'm morally culpable for those actions because they're not part of my community. Thank you.
So done. It was really good.
Go get him,
Connor's gonna be
Connor.
really good now.
Are we ready?
Yeah, we're ready.
Okay. So you say that the social contract is binding only to people that are in the community.
Right, so my only obligations are where I have some sort of contract, that I'm obligated to pay taxes because I receive services like protection from the government.
That's good.
Yeah.
So are you saying that when America intervened, that they were somehow physically, when they intervened in World War II, they were somehow physically like responsible for like Germany coming to their country and invading them
Well, America's response into World War II, their entry into World War II, only happened after they were directly attacked by the Japanese. And they agreed to go into Europe. They created essentially a contract with the other allies saying, we'll help you fight in Europe and defeat Hitler because he's an ally of our enemy who directly attacked us. After we defeat Hitler, we'll turn to Japan.
Okay. So then, on a separate note, why was Gandhi so willing to help Martin Luther King Jr. In a situation that really did not directly affect him, but still he helped in that situation?
I think that's a good question, and this is an example, like I said, he's one of the few people that has really lived his life as an example of someone who goes beyond the obligatory. Gandhi was not morally obliged to, but he made a choice. But had he not chosen to help Martin Luther King, I don't think he would hold Gandhi accountable for civil rights.
This is why we know his name, because of the things that he went beyond in doing.
Sure, and I think people who go beyond obligations to do something beyond what they're required to do and go beyond that, those are the people worth really respecting, but it doesn't mean all of us are obliged to be that
Why can't we
perfect.
all be respected then?
Because we only respect people who go beyond what they're required to do.
So why can't we all be expected to go beyond what we're required to do?
Because I think it's an impossible expectation that would require massive sacrifices, and ultimately I think it could even be bad for society.
But don't we all have impossible expectations?
Those would be ideals that we want to live up to, but not obligations. Obligations, in order to be just, have to be possible.
Those are all the questions. All right, I'm gonna take like 3 minutes.
You take what you want. You say I'm taking some prep time and he'll time you.
Just tell me when 3 minutes.
How do you want me to get you one?
I actually have it, I just didn't.
Now you're gonna, do you get to both out for 3 minutes?
So we had our cross-examination, which was 3 minutes, the 6-3, 7-3 is what we've done so far, 6 minute, then 3 minute cross, 7 minute, 3 minute cross. So now Connor has 4 minutes to do a rebuttal, I'll have 6 minutes, and then he'll have 3 minutes.
Beforehand, you said those 6 minutes?
Yeah. I haven't done that yet.
I know, but are you gonna come up with one right now or on?
So yeah, so it'll be based on what Connor says, you know, so based on what he has to say, criticizing my arguments or expanding on his, that's gonna affect what I wanna say in that 6 minutes. So let's say he completely agrees with my third contention, then maybe I won't even talk about it if he says he agrees with it. But if he argues that one a lot, then maybe I'll focus on that one. So it's gonna depend on what he says.
And you guys, this is the hardest part to prepare for, but I think it speaks most to your understanding of the resolution and to your general sort of intelligent approach to it. Did you hear what she said? Can you keep it in your mind? Can you try to reply? If Bill would stand, he'll repeat some of his points from before that he feels she didn't undermine, and Bill hopefully have some response to what she said about